speak about European integration, sort of a number of things come to mind. And I guess depending on who you speak to, there are different things that might come to mind. For some, the European integration project is mostly a peace project. And that's certainly something that we realize right now, in particular with the Ukraine or Russian invasion into Ukraine. Others would say the European integration project is a big market project and helping the European economy to become competitive on the global market. And yet others might say, well, it's an economic and social welfare project trying to assist the European population in having a good life, both economically and socially. When we speak about environmental policy, we look back at a long history. And formally, the European environmental policy came into being in the mid-1980s when environmental policy was established as a competence of the European Union. Informally, I think it started much before that. It started probably in the early 70s when the first policies came into being that were formally introduced as market policies, but in a way were sort of addressing environmental objectives in form of product standards or production standards that were regulating economic actors in the European Union, at that point the European community. Looking then sort of, or moving forward, the environmental policy sort of grew. It grew mostly in a way kind of due to a number of factors. These factors have to do with environmental movements in Europe. They have to do with environmental crises like the ozone hole, the forest dying, etc. And they also moved forward because some of the member states really addressed that issue and made it to a priority. I said right before that the European integration or the European environmental policy came into being first informally and then was institutionalized with the first big treaty change, the European Single Act. That was the treaty change that established environmental policy as a competence of the European Union. Subsequent treaty changes further developed the policy, and they did that in two ways. They did that both in terms of substance. Substance in the sense that they formalized policy objectives, that they mentioned various environmental policy principles that were supposed to be followed. Principles like precaution or other principles. And they also did that in an institutional or procedural way by changing the way policy making takes place. If we kind of look at environmental policymaking, then sovereignty is certainly something that member states lost over the years. The environmental policy field is a field of so-called mixed competence between Brussels and the member states. And that means that de facto much policy is formulated and decided at Brussels level and implemented in the member states. Also, there's research how much sort of room is left for member states to kind of formulate their own policy. And it's debated how much space is left for member states, but there are some scholars that argue it's 80% of environmental policy that's actually made in Brussels. So that leaves very little room for truly sovereign national activity in that policy field. When we kind of look at the evolution of environmental policy, we, in a way, kind of look back at a policy that first came into being with 6 member states, and then the member states grew, obviously, over the years, and with that growth, also the nature of the policy changed. And if we, in a way, kind of take a relatively simplistic look at it, we would say, well, it became more heterogeneous, it became more complex, compromises became more difficult. I would argue that this might be sort of a little bit too simple, because depending on which member states joined, in a way, kind of the policy also changed in nature. The first enlargement was the southern enlargement. With southern enlargement, 3 new member states joined that. Well, actually, it's the second enlargement after the UK, Ireland, and Denmark changed. But let's stick to southern enlargement. Southern enlargement, in a way, kind of added new topics, topics like ocean pollution, also like soil. The soil in the southern member states is dry rather than wet, as in many of the northern member states. So new topics arose. Obviously, also member states joined that possibly were not so much aware of environmental risks as some of the northern states. The next enlargement was northern enlargement with the Scandinavian countries plus Austria joining. These countries are considered pioneers in environmental policy. So in a way, it eased decision-making and the interest in developing environmental policy increased with that member states. And then the last I lumped them all together, southeastern enlargement is probably what we all have in mind when we speak about enlargement, and we all sort of think of it as an enlargement that makes policymaking so much more complex, so much more heterogeneous, and so much slower, which is partly true. But again, there were sort of new topics that came to the fore. Some topics that have to do with particular resources like coal. But also the whole area of implementation was becoming very topical with that enlargement. And the European Union, in a way, kind of adapted to that by shifting attention to shifted attention from policy making, developing more and more policies, to making sure that the policies also implemented. So with each enlargement, we may have sort of new complications, but we also have new features and new responses at European Union level. We talk about enlargement, but we also kind of talk about the first exit from the European Union with the UK leaving, and that has, in a way, kind of partly still unknown consequences for the European policy making in the environmental field. And it's sort of a little bit ambiguous, because on the one hand, with Britain, sort of let's say, stubborn actor, sometimes sort of a difficult negotiator, left the European Union. So you would think, well, that's good. It might ease processes. On the other hand, the UK was a leader on some policy fields like climate change. So with that, sort of an important actor pushing for European Union action in the field of climate change has left. And also with the UK, obviously sort of a big country, adding critical mass to the European Union left. And that is something that I would anticipate we will note in international negotiations. The European Union in environmental policy is trying to be a leader in international environmental negotiations. And with such an important actor like Britain no longer being part of the Union, it in a way kind of has lost weight in these negotiations. So much for Brexit. And now sort of the Brexit obviously was one of the big challenges we had to respond to. Since then, we have new challenges, and the pandemic obviously was sort of one of these challenges. And what we saw in the context of the pandemic is that there's sort of a close link between not only the environment and economic affairs, but also between the environment and social well-being. And I think one of the future challenges will be to kind of think environmental policy and social cohesion more closely together. That's what I would anticipate. We partly see that already in the European Green Deal and in this big project, Next Gen EU, where sort of funding is made available for social cohesion, for economic recovery, and much of that money, about a third, is actually allocated for environmental objectives. So that's where we kind of see already a response to this link, environment and social cohesion. I mentioned already implementation as one of the big challenges, and I think that continues to be a big challenge. It is sort of a twofold challenge in the sense that it has to do with capacities. So here we're back to the Next Gen EU, sort of, do we have the material capacities, the financial capacities to actually implement policy? If we don't, it might sort of become a break to environmental policy. But also political will is influential in influencing implementation. And here I see sort of the big challenge of the European Union, not only to, in a way, kind of facilitate the policy making, but also to mobilize the general public. The future of the European Union is very hard to predict. And there's lots of literature that kind of speaks about the future of the European Union, and it's kind of divided into the optimists and the pessimists. The optimists, they would kind of reflect on this so-called multi-crisis that the European Union is facing right now, is in a way kind of inspiring new integration efforts, is sort of feeding into learning processes, and that the European Union in a way has adapted to earlier crises in the history of the integration, and it will in a way kind of react to the present crisis as well and develop further. So that's the optimist side. The pessimist side is that these are too many crises, and the crises are kind of too deep and too heavy. The membership has grown to be so heterogeneous, with more and more sort of Euroscepticism in the member states, that the European Union is in a way kind of at the edge towards collapsing. I personally lean towards the more optimistic side, but wouldn't go so far to kind of not reflect on the challenges. And I would anticipate that probably the European Union is somehow adapting to the present challenges, but might do that in a more and more differentiated kind of way. Mm-hmm. Again, there's a literature out there that speaks about differentiated integration, that kind of highlights that there are sort of several integration projects already that are conducted in a differentiated way, in the sense that not all member states have to join. So some sort of sub-projects might be driven by leading states, and others potentially joining later. So that's sort of certainly one version. The other version would be kind of to react more flexibly in the division of labor between the European Union level in Brussels and the member states. And I would anticipate that sort of more, let's say, sort of institutional procedural innovation we will see in these kind of areas in the future.